Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news that relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, Katan, in the news today, the U.S. is calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, but Russia and China are in opposition. So we'll have those details, along with the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to allow Texas to enforce immigration laws. And also suicide in the military. Can anything be done to help the retired service members? So these stories and more, but first, a surprising kidney transplant. Well, the first of its kind, doctors performed a historic transplant surgery. Now, the patient was a 62-year-old man who had been on dialysis for years with failing kidneys. The donor, you ask? A genetically modified pig. You heard right, a GM pig. Now, doctors hope this animal-to-human transplant, known as xenotransplant, will be done more since there are simply not enough human donors for the thousands of people needing organs.
Wow. However, a surgery of this kind is very complicated. Why? Because a human body will often reject foreign tissue like that from an animal. But in this instance, scientists, they actually removed several genes from the pig which can trigger the body to reject it. Well, of course, we're going to have to wait and see in the near future how this is actually going to turn out from this gentleman.
Right, and remember in the past when they've done the heart transplant, I think the last one lasted about 6 weeks, so, you know, we'll see how this kidney goes.
Yeah, and there's rejections even with human-to-human organ transplants, so it really probably depends on the body and the immune system as well.
Right. Well, we often report on the cost of going to war where it concerns money spent, but this next report deals with a much higher price American soldiers are paying with their very lives. Now, the daily stress and rigors of serving in the armed forces has led to many service members taking their own lives in the end. Please pay close attention to the video which explains the problem. Take a look.
Alarming suicide rates among the military and veterans can be traced to the stress and trauma from the long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But those conflicts are over, and suicides remain at what the Pentagon calls an unacceptably high level. As Nick Schifrin details, a new report reveals that within the Army, Armor Brigade combat teams, which revolve around tanks, have the highest suicide rates.
Since 9/11, more than 30,000 active duty service members or veterans of the post-9/11 wars have died by suicide. That is more than 4 times the number of those who've died in combat. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has repeatedly said that even one suicide is too many and that the department must do more to prevent suicide. A new report by the Army Times found the highest rates of suicide are among soldiers in the Army's tank community. In 2021, tank brigades experienced a suicide rate twice as high as the rest of the active duty force. Why?
Nick, it's tragic, frankly. New trends in suicide prevention research are linking daily hassles and sustained stress over time with higher suicide rates. That functions by stripping away the resilience of somebody and potentially making them more vulnerable to suicidal behavior if they experience an acute stressor in their lives. A lot of people in the Army community have known for a long time that the tank brigades are not okay, that they've been run ragged over the past decade. But I didn't realize how deeply that had impacted service members down to the core of their beings. There are service members who do their 3 or 4 year contracts and never know anything but the relentless grind that these types of units have experienced. What we found for Armored Brigade combat teams is that because they've been in such high demand overseas over the past 10 years, that their op tempo, as it's shortened, got largely out of control.
Yeah, that's pretty sad. You know, there's been a lot of, we reported on several instances of problems like this in the military. A lot of people suffering psychological issues because of the stress and the trauma that they see on a daily basis, not to mention some of the problems that occur as well within the military. When they get back home, it's just too much for them to handle, and a lot of them don't really have the support that they need to make it.
Right, and as you mentioned, you know, the report focused on the tank brigades, but it's really all the different forces there in the different fields that suffer that stress of, you know, of military combat.
That's right. Well, the UN Security Council did not approve a U.S.-led ceasefire on Gaza and Israel-Hamas hostage deal. Well, why? Because Russia and China vetoed the proposal put forth by the United States. A White House spokesman John Kirby said this was not a surprise to the U.S. The resolution called for a ceasefire that would last approximately 6 weeks to protect civilians and allow humanitarian aid deliveries into Gaza.
Well, 11 out of the 15-member council voted for the resolution, but as the U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield stated, quote, "Unfortunately, Russia and China decided to exercise its veto." Now, she also explained that the two countries had cynical and petty reasons for their veto for opposing it because it was penned by the U.S. Now, she also criticized both Russia and China for not condemning Hamas's attack on Israel that took place on October 7th, 2023.
The Russian ambassador said the resolution was, quote, "exceedingly politicized and contained an effective green light for Israel to mount a military operation in Rafah," end quote. Well, this city is located in southern Gaza and is a refuge for more than 1 million Gazans who are living there in makeshift tents.
Well, the Chinese ambassador weighed in, saying the U.S. resolution fell short of expectations because it only set preconditions for a ceasefire. Now, he also agreed with the Russian ambassador's comments. The U.S. itself has vetoed 3 previous resolutions that did not have any plans for hostage negotiations. Now, this was the first time the United States administration backed a resolution with the word ceasefire in it, which shows a harder stance that the Biden administration is taking now against Israel.
According to diplomats, the council will come back together to vote on an alternative solution or resolution drafted by elected members of that Security Council.
Well, a ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court made a ruling that allows an immigration law to go into effect. SB 4 allows local and state police to arrest and detain migrants suspected of crossing the border illegally. Now, the federal government has been the sole authority for immigration enforcement for years and considers this an affront to federal law. Now, Texas Governor Greg Abbott sees this ruling as a victory.
Abbott, who's been in a year-long fight with the federal government, signed the SB 4 law after the ruling by Supreme Court saying that they would block the law. Of course, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre made this statement.
Well, she said, quote, "SB 4 is just another example of Republican officials politicizing the border while blocking real solutions," unquote. Now, although the Supreme Court allows the law to take effect, the law still faces challenges in a lower federal court. Now, 2 of the justices questioned the constitutionality of the law, and in a statement made by Ketanji Brown Jackson, she said regarding the SB 4 law, quote, "It's a law that will upend the longstanding federal-state balance of power and sow chaos."
Now, several law enforcement agencies had complaints of not having the resources, and of course, they said they lack the knowledge in how to enforce the laws concerning immigration. Well, the potential for racial profiling is also a great concern for both citizens and migrant activists. Mexico, on the other hand, has said that it won't accept migrants that Texas tries to send back under the new law.
Well, there appears to be a little tension between Israel's prime minister and the U.S. over the war in Gaza Strip and the U.S.'s stance. Now take a look at this video for more on the topic.
The United Nations Security Council on Friday turned down a U.S.-led resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and an Israel-Hamas hostage deal after Russia and China vetoed the measure, a move White House spokesman John Kirby said was hardly a surprise. The resolution called for an immediate ceasefire lasting roughly 6 weeks that would protect civilians and allow for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. 11 of the 15-member council voted for the resolution.
The vast majority of this council voted in favor of this resolution. But unfortunately, Russia and China decided to exercise its veto.
U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield told the Security Council that the two nations had cynical and petty reasons, saying they opposed the resolution simply because it was penned by the U.S. and criticized both countries for not condemning Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel. Russian Ambassador Vasily Nebenzia said the resolution was exceedingly politicized and contained an effective green light for Israel to mount a military operation in Rafah, a city in southern Gaza where more than 1 million Palestinians have been sheltering in makeshift tents. Zhang Jun, China's ambassador, said the U.S. resolution fell short of expectations by only setting preconditions for a ceasefire and echoed Russia's comments. The U.S. has wanted any Security Council support for a ceasefire to be linked to the release of hostages held by Hamas in Gaza, vetoing 3 previous ceasefire resolutions put forward by the Council. Friday was the first time Washington had backed a text with the word ceasefire in it, reflecting a toughening of the Biden administration's stance toward Israel. The Council will reconvene on Saturday morning to vote on an alternative resolution drafted by elected members of the Security Council, diplomats said.
There is a public break tonight between the United States and Israel after the U.S. refused to veto a UN Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accused the U.S. of changing its position on the war in Gaza and canceled a planned visit of his top aides to Washington.
Security Council today, for the first time in more than 5 months of war, demanded a ceasefire in Gaza. And it did so because, as you just said, the U.S. abstained on a vote. Resolution 2728, quote, demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a lasting and sustainable ceasefire, and also demands the immediate and unconditional release of all the hostages. So while we keep up that text, just a few points. 1, the holy month of Ramadan is already halfway over. 2, the word lasting was replaced because the U.S. asked for it rather than the word permanent. And 3, that paragraph there refers to a ceasefire and hostage release in the same paragraph. An earlier draft allowed those two things to be split, and that is what the reason why the U.S. abstained today, according to U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield.
We fully support some of the critical objectives in this non-binding resolution, and we believe it was important for the Council to speak out and make clear that our any ceasefire must come with the release of all hostages.
But the resolution did not condition the ceasefire on the hostage release, nor did it condemn Hamas's terrorist attack of October the 7th. And that is why Netanyahu said today, hey, look, that's what you were calling for in your own draft resolution. You have changed your policy. That led to Netanyahu canceling this delegation that was supposed to arrive tomorrow to Washington. And it led to this statement by Israeli Ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan.
Your demand for a ceasefire without conditioning it on the release of the hostages not only is not helpful, but it undermines the efforts to secure their release. To this Council, Israeli blood is cheap. This is a travesty, and I'm disgusted.
Well, it's difficult enough to get two people to agree, not alone two countries or multiple countries to agree on one particular point. You know, the countries really need to be looking at not just a ceasefire, but a cessation of war altogether. Because as we've mentioned before in previous reports, there are no winners when it comes to war, and it's really the civilians that are paying the greatest cost when two countries are bumping heads.
Right, absolutely. And, you know, the Israeli ambassador there showing his total disgust with the United States for changing their stance with the whole Israel war going on. So, but as you mentioned, you know, that is secondary to the suffering of the the people there over in Palestine, which are really the ones that are taking the brunt of all the attacks, not being able to get in the humanitarian aid that they really need, trying to work and so forth. So terrible situation, and seems to be continuing to get worse.
That's right. Well, there is a way to stop all wars, and if you'd like to learn more about that, as Yisrael Hawkins has mentioned it many times throughout the years, contact the House of Yahweh. And when you do contact the House of Yahweh, don't forget to request your free copies of the monthly newsletter and the Prophetic Word magazine. Here's how.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites by going to Yahweh.com, YisraelHawkins.com, or Yahweh'sBranch.com. You can also visit our website by going to YPNnews.com. If you would like to email the House of Yahweh, you can do so by emailing info@Yahweh.com. Any international calls, you can call the number that's on the screen now. And once again, don't forget to check out the Yisrael Says program by going to YisraelSays.com and the Ask Yisrael program by going to AskYisrael.com.
Well, don't go anywhere, because up next is another classic sermon by Yisrael Hawkins. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
Thank you for watching.